Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Claudia Diaz. I'm the transport consultant at the IDV, and I will be your master of ceremony today. Thank you for joining us here to talk about the role of inclusive mobility as a catalyst for sustainable development. In this session, we will discuss how fostering social inclusive transport systems are essential to achievement a sustainable low-carbon development path. We are opening this session with a 3-minute video to warm up the conversation we're having here today.
Así como hay buses en buen estado, hay buses en mal estado completamente, que de repente uno viene o va para el trabajo o la universidad y se queda a medio camino.
Ya cuando vas ya va un transporte bien saturado, va bien lleno y luego aparte pues no te hacen parada porque llevas muchos bultos o llevas muchas bolsas y la verdad pues prefiero mejor irme caminando.
Well, my kids, my 12-year-old and my 6-year-old, they don't have no choice but to walk. They catch the bus to a certain point and then they have to walk the rest because there's no bus that goes that way. So they have to walk about 6 blocks over to get to school. The same thing they do in the morning, they do in the evening. So around 4 o'clock, I call, and once I hear that they're home safe, then I'm relieved and I go back to work.
La infraestructura en términos como de paradas o estaciones, digamos, donde el bus se detiene, también están en muy mala calidad. Hay algunas donde ni siquiera hay algún tipo de techo para taparse ante lluvia o sol o lo que fuesen. La conexión entre la parada y el autobús en muchas ocasiones ni siquiera respeta leyes de accesibilidad para personas con discapacidad.
Lima podría ser una ciudad perfecta para hacer bicicleta, ¿no? Por el clima y porque es plano, ¿no? Pero, salvo los barrios, digamos, de nivel socioeconómico AB, donde sí hay ciclovías, en los barrios populares, ¿no? No hay ese tipo de infraestructura, ¿no? Digamos, hay un solo Dios y se llama automóvil privado.
Nuestras calles no están preparadas para el despliegue de biciclos, o sea, de bicicletas. Y tampoco están acondicionadas así las veredas, ni siquiera para caminar tanto. En épocas de lluvia lo que es intransitable, muchas zonas todavía cuesta muchísimo en autos que son así bajitos. No hay un sistema de transporte interno dentro de nuestra comunidad.
Now, I would like to welcome Ana Maria Pinto, Chief of the Transport Division, acting interim at the Inter-American Development Bank, for the opening remarks. Ana Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claudia. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this timely discussion about poverty, transport, and social inclusion. I would like to thank our panelists, Tony, Maria Eugenia, Juan Pablo, Daniel, and Lake, and of course, Lynn, our moderator, and as well the transport lead on social inclusion and the person that has been leading this matter at the bank in the later years. As many as you know, Latin America and the Caribbean is one of the most unequal regions in the world, where 10% of the population of the people with the wealthiest income compares with 22 times greater than the income of the poorest population. Additionally, the high rates of poverty and inequality have historically placed a disproportionately heavy burden on specific populations, groups such as women, children, indigenous people, Afro-descendants, and people with disabilities. Therefore, connecting people to employment and education and health opportunities and giving them access to safe, reliable, and affordable transportation services is key to eradicating poverty and bringing sustainable development. However, the degree of access to opportunities that transport can provide can vary widely among different groups of the population in our region, and this is closely linked to where people live, and the individual characteristics and capabilities, such as income, age, ability, as well as the land use patterns and the availability of transport in their communities. One of the priorities of the bank is how to provide to this population better opportunities and addressing poverty and inequality. We convinced that mobility and accessibility are essential elements for a dignified life and the development of people and societies, and this has been stated as one of the priorities of the new administration at the Inter-American Development Bank. This is especially relevant for disadvantaged populations that have been traditionally left behind during the planning processes of urban transport. While underprivileged groups are more likely than others to depend on public transit and walking for the daily task, they're also more likely to experience transport disadvantages and physical barriers in transport systems. Additionally, at the same time, people's choices for travel times and destinations are limited due to the fear of crime and sexual harassment, especially for women in the region. In addition, vulnerable populations are more likely to suffer from the negative effects to the sector, including traffic-related noise, pollution, and of course, road safety related injuries and fatalities. Therefore, as we discussed in our flagship publication, Transport for Inclusive Development, Defining a Path for Latin America and the Caribbean, that was developed with lots of partners, some of them present here today, a new model is urgently needed in the region, one that has begun implementing in many projects, but that we need to mainstream in lots of our countries, and one that puts people at the center of the design of the project, that places emphasis and the attention towards fulfilling the needs of different kind of groups, as I said, regardless of the income, the age, the ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender. While this publication highlights some of the problems and the shortcomings that we have in the region and how transport is not addressing the role of this of poverty and social inclusion or the effects, it also present evidence on some of the solutions on the transport projects that have worked and how they have really contribute to reduce the inequalities in the region and in other areas. That's to give to the transport practitioners, policymakers, and all of us involved in transport in the region real solutions and tools to be able to hopefully advance and overcome some of the challenges. So we hope the discussion today will help you catalyze our work and really, as I say, give real solutions to create concrete projects and implementation of them in the region. So thank you so much, and please go ahead with the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Now I would like to present the moderator of this panel of this session today, Lynn Schul, lead specialist at the IDB. Lynn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you, Ana Maria, for that great introduction to this topic. As you cannot hear. Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So as you already explained, transport is a key enabler to access opportunities. That's essential for promoting economic growth in the region, as well as the reduction of poverty and inequality. Therefore, it is essential that this topic that we're discussing today, that's discussed also in this publication that you see on the screen, it's important that we continue to push to raise these issues here and to make our way forward to make sure that these issues are forefront in any planning exercise, any transportation plan, to catalyze a more sustainable and inclusive development agenda and urban mobility. I'm delighted today to welcome our expert panelists who will delve deeper into what drives these critical conditions of transport-related social exclusion, poverty and inequality, and to also talk about the solutions as they see it and what we can do better to have a more inclusive mobility system. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Toni Brodber. Ms. Brodber is the UN Women Representative in the Caribbean Cluster Office. Toni has been at the forefront of numerous inclusive development projects in the Caribbean, the Pacific, Europe, and Africa, where with the support of different partners, she seeks to ensure that no one is left behind. Please welcome Toni.
Thank you, Lynn. So today in this conversation of leaving no one behind, the question is, how are you left behind, or why were you left behind? How do we define vulnerability within this space? since 1993, the first Small Island Developing States Conference in Barbados at the time, there was a request for multi-dimensional vulnerability indicators, partially because of the fact that's been raised earlier. Latin America and the Caribbean has some of the most inequality in the world, yet if you look only at GDP, we're looking at very high to middle income countries. And you're not seeing the ways in which, whether it's transportation or other aspects of development, are exacerbating these kinds of inequalities. What's interesting now is we know, based on last year, the government of Belize asked the General Assembly to push on developing these multidimensional vulnerability indicators. Transportation or access to transportation is not one of the indicators that has been raised. Connectivity is there, but it's internet connectivity. And there's so many people who depend on transportation for their access to economic empowerment. What we know is that generally, women are those who use and depend on public transportation the most. And IDB has done incredible research on this. UN Women is now starting to get into this space. And as I told my co-panelist, Daniel, part of the reason we got into this space was because we were looking at violence against women and girls. And rather than only looking at changing behaviors, what are the built environmental factors that contribute to the experience of violence that people experience within public spaces? So we know that within our region, women are using transportation the most, but women are also most afraid to use transportation. Because of the violence in our region, it's not only women. The rates of men who are afraid to use transportation are also quite high. It's around 65%. So what can we do within this space to ensure that there's more safety within this space? But also, because we're looking at small island developing states in the Caribbean, the difference is if we're not looking at climate resilient solutions, we're not looking at sustainable solutions. They will not survive the next hurricane season, which begins in May, June. So the conversation that we have been having in terms of the research is understanding that you can use the gender lens as an entry point to understand where the gaps are within the transportation system, but you must take an intersectional analysis to understand the socioeconomic challenges that exacerbate the gender biases that women may face when intersecting with the transportation space. In particular, the use of transportation for their care responsibilities. Most women have indicated that they're using public transportation to get children to school, to medical appointments, and of course themselves to work. When we have a climactic event in the space, we're recognizing that they are not going to be able to rely on any kind of efficiency of the transportation space in terms of the public transportation space. And policy-wise, we're seeing in the same way that we're not seeing transportation prioritized in a multi-dimensional vulnerability index, it's not being prioritized either in national development strategies or national adaptation plans. So it's almost a siloed conversation that is not seen as the great connector for the majority of the population that is most economically depressed to economic opportunity. What we've seen work is, yes, of course, electric transportation options have worked in Barbados. We understand that 50% of the fleet right now is electric, which is excellent. It puts Barbados as third in the region for having electric public transportation buses. However, most people do not depend on state transport. Most people are depending on private and informal transportation for public transport. And that's where we have a lack of accountability in terms of whatever happens within that space. And unfortunately, again, this is the gender-based violence lens, unfortunately, coming out, where we saw a lot of women losing their lives by getting into private cars that they were depending on to get to work or to get to home. So how can we center the transportation conversation in the broader development conversation to ensure that it is both climate resilient and it is effective and safe is critical for us to be able to achieve any form of gender equality or women's empowerment within our space. And the next slide speaks to some of this. But it was more so that you could understand visually some of the challenges that we're experiencing and the fact that the legislative space is not making those connections is exacerbating some of the gaps. So whether you're environmentally or friendly or not, we need to be having conversations about the private space and the informal space and how we can ensure that the reliability and accountability within those spaces are what they need to be for safety reasons, and the infrastructure around the entire public transportation routes, the lighting, where the bus terminals are, all of these things are going to be critical aspects of whether people use the public transportation systems or not. The last thing is that in Trinidad and Tobago, we have now 8 locally rideshare companies. They're doing very well. One is specific for women. It's called Pink Cab, but the most popular one is called TT Rideshare. It's about 41,000 trips per month that they're doing at this stage, which is a lot for our population. That said, they are starting to collect the matrix to ensure accountability for themselves. And even though per kilometer they're 3 to 5 times more expensive than the state-funded or private public transportation routes, this is becoming the public transportation choice for most people right now in Trinidad and Tobago.
Really interesting to hear about how important gender is, and yet it isn't at the forefront of the policy making. And that's really interesting what you said about the private transportation is where most of the gender-based violence is happening, which is quite different from in the Latin American region, which I think highlights even more that we need to be focusing more in the Caribbean, because we often have a lot of data in the Latin American region, but we need more focus in the Caribbean, and because it is quite different in its context. And so those are very interesting remarks. Thank you so much. I'd like to go to our next speaker, Daniel Oviedo. Daniel is an associate professor at the University College of London and the director of the International Network for Transport and Accessibility in Low-Income Communities in Latin America. He's a leading scholar over 14 years, with over 14 years of experience in the transport field, where he studied accessibility and social inequalities in cities in the Global South. And he's going to speak to us today about public transportation, accessibility, and affordability. Please welcome Daniel.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. And I really recommend that you read that book because it has a lot of interesting data. Not because I wrote one of the chapters, but but I'm going to talk to you about one of the chapters that I wrote. And I want to start with this slide because probably one of the most politicized things and more contested issues that we have around transport, particularly public transport, is the issue of the fare, right? And how much it costs for people. And we think about it, there is a huge share of the Latin American and Caribbean population that every day gets priced out of public transport. Not just because of the fact that they cannot afford it, but because of everything else that you need to trade off when you cannot afford it. So the fact that you have to forego trips, the fact that you need to walk for hours and hours, usually under very precarious conditions, and I'm very happy that Eugenia is here because she's going to speak to us about that as well. So I have here 3 photos from 3 completely different contexts. One is Brazil, and we know what happened when the fare was increased in Brazil recently, and that led to a whole political upheaval. But you can also find protests very frequently, perhaps in the provider sector. So you have that photo on the left of Mexican colectivo drivers who were protesting because they consider the fare unfair, if you want. And then the last one is from Barranquilla, and I really like this one because it speaks about not only something that can help you get to where you need to go, but actually to do it in a dignified service, and I would add affordable as well. So we move to the next one, and I'm going to start showing you a bit numbers. You don't need to look at the numbers themselves, just to the colors. And again, I'm building here on research that colleagues, including Eugenia, have done before on affordability. So if you see distribution of affordability of public transport, and this is for a fixed basket of 60 trips per month across different cities throughout the region, you see that we are doing more or less well in terms of the average income, and that's a problem. And it's a problem because we usually plan for the average. And we plan for the income that the X percentage, 50, 60% of the population has. What happens with everyone else? That's what you find in column B. So in column B, we see that for the majority of cities in our region, we don't go much below 15% of income for people just getting to work and coming back by public transport, which is, of course, a significant issue. We have specific cases such as Asunción, Brasilia, or San Jose, where you get a relatively decent percentage of the income, of the lowest quintile of the population. But then my question, and that's something that you will see across the panel today, is what happens with equity, and where is the equity in there? And that's what brings me to column C. And is where you see that in cities, in countries such as Bahamas and Honduras, the poor, or the poorest of the poor, actually spend 5 or 6 times what the average of the population does in public transport, just getting to work. So what happens with care mobilities? What happens with going to the hospital? What happens with going and seeing family and traversing the city? That's part of the question and the challenge that we are addressing here. If we go to the next slide, then you will see that I'm missing one slide, actually. But I'm going to tell you. So the answer to many of these issues actually come from the informal sector. And we had this wonderful quote in the report, which is, sin lo trucho el pobre se muere, which is, without the informal, many of the poor couldn't even get to their jobs. So informal transport does provide a significant solution, and perhaps there are many here that would argue for not calling it informal, but actually popular transport, because it has been the solution for the majority of the communities, the traditional communities that have resided in these places. So just a few examples. If you look, for example, at Soacha in Bogota, in the periphery of Bogota in Colombia, on the one hand, negotiating prices was commonplace, but if you look at what does that mean for affordability, it can mean a reduction of 30 to 40% of the regular fare. However, it is true that not everything around popular transport can be shiny and pink-colored. So you see, for example, that in Lima, women reported that although you can, in fact, negotiate the price of the fare, because of the position, right, of a woman facing a man operating a vehicle who has essentially the power to let you use it or not, they felt prevented from negotiating the fare. So in average, women end up paying more than men in informal transport in many contexts. And in Port-au-Prince, and that's why I tell you, please read the book, we had this case study where we managed to look at what was the average income for different sectors, and we found that domestic workers spend nearly 25% of their average income of that sector in informal transport using tap-taps, which are ubiquitous across Haiti. So what are the choices? What choices do we have? And here I want to show you, now I want to direct your attention to the slides, to a bit of a dream. Because in Bogota, and this was a project that was initially supported by the World Bank a few years ago, there is these targeted subsidies, which are called the pro-poor public transport subsidies. And what I like about this system, more than giving conditional cash transfers for the poor to use public transport, is that they were using the strengths of other sectors. 1 minute. And what that means is that everyone that was eligible, which if you count the population that is under the score of eligibility in Bogota is around 2.4 million people, and in Soacha, which is a big municipality next to it, is almost 200,000. Once you have a solution such as Transmilenio and sort of a good public transport system, and you add a conditional subsidy that can make at least half of your commute cheaper, you can get increases in accessibility of around 135% for the poorest of the poor in the periphery. So I'm going to stop there, and then we can talk about solutions for taking this forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel. That's fascinating. I think you made a really good point that while the poor often cannot afford public transportation, there's also the other side of the coin that drivers are also working under conditions that are not dignified, and in order to have a dignified public transportation service that's affordable for all, that's dignified, and that pays workers what they deserve to be paid, I think we have to talk about financing. So I think that's another question that we need to look at is how do we finance all this, and perhaps looking at congestion pricing or other types of revenues, but placing public transportation and modes that are important for low-income populations, but also for sustainability as a higher priority in the fiscal space, I think is key. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Eugenia Rivas. Eugenia, sorry, I have too many notes going on here. She is the e-mobility regional project advisor at the United Nations Environmental Program with more than 10 years of experience in the sector, working on multidisciplinary teams in transport consultancies and international organizations. She is responsible for preparing financing proposals for the Green Climate Fund in 14 Latin American and Caribbean countries. Please welcome Eugenia.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, active transport modes, usually known as active transport or non-motorized transport, mainly refers to walking and cycling. The benefits of active transport modes far exceed the objectives of mobility itself. They generate benefits in terms of health and wellness, and as well as enjoyment. And increasing walking and cycling also reduce traffic congestion and reduce air and noise pollution. However, for low-income people, the decision to travel using active transport modes, especially walking, is not based on sustainability or health reasons. It's mainly based on affordability. Additionally, low-income people walk because usually they don't have other transport options. Therefore, low-income people rely on walking not out of choice, but out of necessity, becoming captive walkers. Moreover, in several cities in the region, walking is the main transport mode in low-income groups. As we can see right now in this graph, we can see walking trips as a percentage of total trips divided by low-income levels for 3 cities in the region, Bogotá, Sao Paulo, and Santiago de Chile. And we can see that around 30 to 45% of all trips taken by low-income groups are on foot, in contrast to around 20% among the highest income groups. Next. Although the low-income group has the highest share of walking trips, these groups face the poorest walking conditions. Walking conditions in low-income neighborhoods can be hazardous and often are characterized by unpaved roads and vulnerable weather routes. For example, unpaved routes can become impassable during and after rainy days, and it is not uncommon for several cities in the region it's not uncommon that children miss school because of the difficulties associated to transiting muddy areas. And also, in the previous slide, also steep roads can represent a mobility barrier, especially, as Tony said, for caregivers that are predominantly women, and also for elderly people, children, and people with disabilities. In the next, please, thank you. In addition, low-income populations face heavily trafficked streets, lacking adequate pedestrian infrastructure, such as, for example, sidewalks, medians, and protected crosswalks. This exposes low-income groups to several risks, such as, for example, noise and air pollution, and also traffic-related injuries and fatalities. And the next. We can see in this graph, we can see the traffic fatality statistics. We can see pedestrians in dark blue and cyclists in light blue for several cities in the region. For most of the cities in this graph, cyclists and pedestrians account for more than 40% of total road traffic deaths. And in particular, in the cases of Bogotá and Panama City, they account for more than 50%. And even though we don't have available statistics divided by income level, the burden mainly falls The burden mainly falls on low-income groups because they are more likely to rely on active transport modes. This amplifies inequalities in the transport sector. And finally, I would like to make some summary points. There is an urgent need to consider active transport modes as an integral part of transport systems. Cities can improve access for underserved groups by focusing on and integrating 4 action points. First, increasing citizen participation in transport policies. Second, improving planning and regulation, for example, monitoring non-motorized infrastructure and using indicators identifying low-income users. And third, developing non-motorized infrastructures and services that benefit low-income areas, such as increasing, for example, the connectivity of cycling infrastructure and the coverage of bike share systems in peripheral and low-income areas. And 4, integrating non-motorized transport services into a more connected network. In conclusion, in Latin America and the Caribbean, walking and cycling play a key role in the mobility of low-income groups, who account for a high share of total trips. However, the use of active transport modes is driven by affordability issues. In addition, they face poor conditions for walking and cycling and lack of access to infrastructure. Improving access to better quality and more integrated active transport services represents an opportunity to advance the accessibility and social inclusion of low-income groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenia, that was great. So I think you captured well exactly the trade-off that Daniel was mentioning when he said that when people can't afford public transportation, they have to make several sacrifices, and one of them is having to walk under conditions that are extremely hazardous for their health and unsafe in other ways as well. I think relating to the gender issues that you brought up, gender violence, there's also a lot of sexual harassment and insecurity walking in many places in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Juan Pablo Bocorejo. He is a professor of civil engineering and co-founder of the Sustainability Studies Group at the University de los Andes. Formerly, he was the Mobility Secretary of Bogota. His research focuses on the economics of transport accessibility and inequalities linked to mobility, road safety, and public transportation. Today, he's going to talk to us about the role of spatial inequalities in transportation. Please welcome Juan Pablo.
Thank you to the Inter-American Development Bank for this invitation. And thank you to all our co-authors. I had a lot of fun working in this book. I learned a lot of things, seeing these inequality subjects from different points of view was very, very important. For decades, the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank have been promoting transport projects, mass transit projects. So at the beginning it was probably more rail systems. Afterwards we started to fund BRTs, then cable cars. And we always had this idea that that was the right way to do it, and that it was going to help inequalities. And it will bring this integration of societies. However, the first question was, are we really measuring the way we are improving this accessibility or this inclusion in our projects? And probably the answer is no. We don't have indicators that make us see if these kind of projects are really have an impact on the poor, on the access, and we can have a very common quote: what you can't measure, you can't improve. So this is a first thing I wanted to ask and to open the discussion. And it's it's on the speech, but we are really not promoting a good way to measure it and to follow the investment. So if we want to improve inequalities in transportation, we should provide more accessible systems and more affordable systems. So as Daniel was mentioning, there are several projects that have been developed in Latin America related to make more affordable fares, especially the one in Bogota when we work in the proper subsidy. But then it is interesting to see it as a researcher. So you see the data and you ask people what are how much do you spend in transportation, and it seems obvious that you must act on fares. But then I worked on the governance side. And in the governance side, the big question is how to distribute these resources that are never enough. And then you are faced with the challenge, should I invest in electric buses? Should I invest in having a bigger BRT network? Should I invest in the first metro line? Or should I lower the tariffs, or should I give more subsidy? And so there is really a big challenge here in terms of policy that we have to work on. And the second big issue in our cities is location. So the chapter I worked on in the book is called Location Matters. So what we try to show there is the way population and activities are distributed in our cities are very unequal. So the poor spend 2 hours sometimes in Bogota just to get to work in the morning and 2 more hours in the afternoon. And they spend almost 30% of what they earn in the family. So it is a very complicated situation. And here the big challenge is really changing the way we are planning transportation, really including land use. So the big promise and what we have been working on as TOD needs to be improved. So we have to really find ways to have this better planning of the transport projects to include the transformation of the cities.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. That was great.
I need the clicker in my hands. It doesn't
Thank
work
you.
any other way.
Yeah. Juan Pablo, I think your remarks are really critical. I think, as you mentioned, there's always a scarcity of public resources, and so how do you, what do you decide to do first, and how do you generate the revenue that you need in order to, you don't need to answer it right now, you can answer it in the QA, but I think that's a very interesting point, and I think that land use is key, because if you have more compact land use and more mixed use planning that's coordinated with transit, you can have more efficient and cost-effective transit systems in the long run. So, but in the short run, we need to generate revenue for these investments as well. Our next speaker, I should say, is Lake Sagres. Lake is an associate adjunct professor at the Center for Sustainable and Urban Development, the Center for Excellence in Bus Rapid Transit, and the I should have put my glasses on. Sorry. The Catholic University of Chile. I think I butchered that. Sorry. She's an internationally recognized expert on cycle-inclusive urban planning, civil society development, and participatory planning theory and practice. Please welcome Lake.
Thank you. Am I on? Yes? You're good. Okay. Well, I think all these numbers are fabulous, and they're really useful, and they're really important. if we're looking at numbers of where we're at today, they tell us where we're at today, and modeling can give us some sense of where we're going tomorrow. But they really don't tell us how to get there. So we really need to look much more closely at people and behavior and values and societies and how we all work together. So that's what I do. I have a laboratory for social change. And we actually use a lot of action research and participatory action research, because actually I think we can't do this without people. It was a wonderful session on road safety a few minutes ago, but we talked about infrastructure. And the problem isn't infrastructure, the problem is people and the way some people drive. And that's sort of the elephant in the room, is power and social imaginaries and how they work in society. And the most terrible kind of exclusion is from the power to make basic decisions about the quality of your life. So I'm just going to give you a few high points on how I got to some of this. Health and transport really forces us to connect our own bodies with the environment, and there's a lot of figures and a lot of documentation about why this is important and why transport is particularly important. But then if we look at gender in what's happening on our roads and in transportation, what we find is both cycling, walking, women, we're subordinates on the road. And violence is used to keep us in our place. So if you're a cyclist and you get hit by a car, it's not because of the way the car was driven, it's because of what you were wearing. Hey, if you're a woman and you get raped or hassled, wow, it's because of what you're wearing, or you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. We talk about complete streets, but we don't talk about crime. So there are three kinds of violence that play out together, that form a really powerful braid that chokes those of us who are in subordinate positions for one reason or another, or maybe the whole list of reasons, and keep us off the road and away from access and so on. So we really have to stop talking about these as if they were just technical issues. These are very profound social issues. And in fact, the thing about violence is it's used to keep the subordinates in their place. So road violence keeps people from walking. It keeps us from cycling. The infrastructure is actually there, but because of the way drivers are taught to drive, we're excluded from it. So there's a lot of strategies. I've just done an overview of key practices. There's more than 30 different approaches to talking about what we need to change, what kinds of recipes we can use. And someone just told me I have a minute, but actually I'm timing and I have 2, so sorry, but I'm going to stick to my a few things. One is that when we look at placemaking, which is probably one of the longest standing and one of the most complete perspectives, the first thing they say is it has to be community driven. Several people have mentioned participation. Well, what kind of participation? It has to be empowered participation. People can't just be called in off the street to give an opinion as if this were a survey. They have to deliberate. Local identities have to go into the signage and the icons and the way routes are planned and the way they're implemented. So democracy is actually really essential to getting better roads and safer roads. And I actually, we just did a kind of funny study in 3 different parts of Santiago where they implemented more walkable, more cyclable policies. And although it's the same city, same governance system, same institutions in theory, well, guess what? In La Reina, the wealthy area, they called up the local government and they had a residents-only parking and low traffic area within a couple of months. Bella Vista, a mixed area, which is kind of a scrapper, which is where I live as well, it took us 3 years. And in Renca, a low-income area, which actually had the mayor on their side, wow, even they had a hard time because the Ministry of Transport at the time said no, and they had to invent a procedure for jumping through a loophole, so that even with all those factors lined up, there were a lot of barriers, and the barriers are power. So we really need to talk about that elephant in the room. And just to close on this, when we talk about citizen participation, it's just about anything. And it's really sad to think that Sherry Arnstein offered us a ladder like almost 40, 50 years ago, and we're still diddling around at the bottom of the ladder with therapy and manipulation, and we are not empowering, we are not partnering with civil society the way we should. So we need to be much more precise about what participation is, and it has to be really closely related to democratization of planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Lake. That was very interesting. I think it's your point is really clear and right on, that we need to look at social issues and social activism and the role of that, and including participatory planning to make transport more inclusive. Now I'd like to ask each of you a quick question. We don't have a lot of time left, but if you could just 1 minute each, I'll ask you Juan Pablo first. What can Latin American and Caribbean cities do to materialize plans that integrate transport and land use that consider affordable housing and inclusive accessibility?
Well, it really needs to start from an institutional strength. And from the beginning, when you are planning the big projects. So the projects that have been successful lately in Colombian cities, for example, Medellin and Bogota, they have been working on developing land use, on developing activity centers for the communities, and this is almost as important as developing the BOT line or the cable car line. So I think that's important, but we need to institutionalize that. So we need to start looking like Washington Metro company that is working a lot on TOD, or even if we can look like at the top standard is Hong Kong Metro company. So when we created Bogota Metro company, that is very recent, we put a division that is in charge of TOD. So what the message is, the institutions must look like what we want to have outside. We cannot pretend that the metro company that is full of transport engineers is going to really develop a new way of including urban transport. So that would be my message.
This is on. Tony, with regards to Agenda 2023, there's a lot of reference to leaving no one behind. What metrics have been used to define vulnerability in access to public spaces and use of public transportation in the Latin American Caribbean region? Who is left behind and why? I know that's a lot for 1 minute, but if you...
Yeah, I think I covered a lot of it in what I said as well. I think at this stage we do not have a metric that is fully comprehensive of the vulnerabilities within SIDS. We should after the next General Assembly this year. And even that one is still not reflective of transportation. And I think all of the panelists have spoken to some very interesting issues, but if the management of the shifts that need to happen within transportation are not centralized within broader government strategies for their development, it is going to be siloed and it will never be as inclusive and operational as it needs to be. And I just wanted to make one correction. It's 75,000 trips a month that TT Rideshare does. They have 4,100 drivers. But if we don't figure those things out, metric-wise, the people who are left behind will continue to be women. I mean, whoever has been left behind originally, for whatever our sociocultural history has been. We've been talking as well about where there are no sidewalks and why there are no sidewalks. Generally, these are in post-colonial spaces where the people who were using public transport were not prioritized in policymaking. So if we're not thinking about transportation as a key means to address some of those previous inequalities, what we'll have is an exacerbation of the inequalities that already existed.
Thank you. So Daniel, I'd like to ask you next. Given all that you've explained to us in your presentation, what strategies for inclusive and equitable pricing in public transportation are most effective and available at present day in LAC?
Yeah, I was pointing at the need for targeting and stop planning for the average, and I think for that we need better information so we can actually reflect what are those needs of those who tend to be forgotten. For example, if we use household travel surveys to make decisions, but what happens with the mobile? Are they mobile because they cannot afford their mobility, and where would they want to go? And of course, with better information, we can target better our mechanisms for fares and try to reduce the gaps. I mean, there are people that can pay for public transport, so I don't think we should point at zero fare public transport, because in a way it's unfair, and there are those who should pay for it if they can. But more importantly, I think that we should also consider the temporal dimension of transport affordability. I mean, not everyone needs to travel at the same time, and not everyone is traveling to the same place, and that can cost differently from an operational perspective. And one final thing that I would say is we need to think ambitiously in the long term. So you can think about potentially a target of a zero fare public transport in 30 years, but planning for that means also thinking about new sources of revenue. How are we charging for the externalities of the private vehicle, and how are we finding other solutions to the operation that is not coming essentially from the user themselves, but actually pricing out through land use and through other mechanisms for leveraging revenue. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Eugenia, I know you spoke in your remarks about some solutions, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to add if you had a call for action in terms of how we can better design and allocate and invest in active transportation infrastructure for low-income communities. How would you do that?
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Well, first, if we improve active transport, then accessibility for low-income population is automatically improved, because low-income groups are the ones that walk more. However, active transport alone is not enough to improve accessibility of low-income groups. For example, if we think in working opportunities, low-income groups usually live in the periphery of the cities, far away from the employment centers, and usually travel distances exceed more than 10 kilometers. And then this makes only motorized trips impractical, because it's not practical maybe to walk or to cycle more than 10 kilometers. And then these limitations of active transport modes highlight the importance of combining active transport with other transport modes, especially public transport. For example, combining public transport with cycling provides more flexible alternatives than each transport mode on its own, because they together, cycling and public transport, increase the speed and also the flexibility for long and short trips. And in two ways, basically. First, because bicycles increase the door-to-door accessibility and allow for flexibility and personal adaptation. And second, because public transport improves the speed and also the spatial reach of trips.
Great, thanks, Eugenia. And Lake, given all that you said, how do you think local activists and planners should craft strategies for transforming streets and cities to be more inclusive, and how should they work together?
Well, thank you. I think that's a really important question, because if we look at the history of humanity, and historians are kind of short in transportation communities, we don't often have historians speaking at these kinds of conferences. But if we do, social movements are the ones who've changed everything. We have sewage, we have electricity, we have public education, we have public health, because there were social movements that achieved this. And so I think just as we need to think of an ecology of transportation modes, walk, bike, bus, together for short, medium, long distances, we really need to cultivate ecologies of social movements, very diverse ones. If you go to the National Museum of African American History, what's most amazing to me about that place is the incredible diversity of tactics and organizations that were involved in achieving social change. It's the same with us. These informal operators, cycle rickshaws, for example, these are self-managing social, economic organizations that generate survival where the dominant economic form hasn't managed to do it. So how do we keep them alive? How do we involve them in the system? How do we improve the system? Same with street vendors, same with women.
Great, thank you, Lake. Now with the time that we have left, I'd like to see if there are any questions from the audience for our panelists.
I don't know if okay, it's on. Hi, my name is Sarah Cassius. I work at the World Resources Institute, mostly on bus electrification projects in the Global South. I really liked both of the conversations around placemaking and also informal transit. I know, us when we do projects in the Global South and any kind of organizations that implement like that, when you think about bottom up, the bottom is usually government actors. And I think a lot of the conversations that were had today were more around community organizations and the informal sector. So I was wondering if you guys have seen any kind of best practices or examples of how there's been engagement by organizations like the ones that we have in the room today with community members, or even bridging the gap between like the informal sector and the state, or whoever the main beneficiary usually is. Thank you.
Great, I think direct that to both Lake and Daniel. If Lake, do you want to go first?
Okay, so two really interesting examples. One is the more traditional pro-cycling organizations, particularly when they branch out from being male-only or male-dominated and women get involved, because as soon as you have women involved, what you find is that the road warrior image that eschews cycle lanes and other provisions, it kind of disappears, and you get a much more diverse, social, inclusive perspective. The other thing that has been really interesting in Chile is watching a very Latin American experience of civil society development in rather hostile conditions, and seeing how one of the things that started as a roundtable in a local community, Independencia, the mesas de movilidad, so roundtables around mobility, has now become a practice that's being applied all over the country. And it's very interesting because it echoes the recommendations of a high-level commission in 2015 that there should be these kinds of participatory roundtables in every city. Those recommendations were shelved for different political and power considerations, but the roundtables are springing up at the bottom and in the middle level as well.
Just a very quick addition to that, and I'm not going to talk about informal transport because I think Lake has covered already, but in Colombia there are a few examples where the local government and the regional government has engaged with children for thinking about the imaginations and the visioning of the street and of their walking environments or the transport environments, and that has led to very interesting transformations and sort of a sense of ownership that is contagious, literally, and it goes as well to the rest of the community. So I think that's a very interesting example that is worth exploring further.
There's one question from online. So how can we get decision makers to focus on the needs of users of privately owned paratransit services rather than either auto drivers or state-owned, heavily subsidized bus companies?
Okay, that was too complicated. So I wanted to pass on that one. So we really need to focus where the investment goes. So as Daniel was saying a moment ago, we cannot work on the average fare. We should really work on subsidies for all the students, for example. That's something that is asked a lot in Colombian cities because it's too expensive. So we really need to focus on the people who really need them. So that's why the ProPoor subsidy was so successful.
Please go ahead.
Hi. Okay. Hello, everyone. Fantastic panel. Thank you. I'm Salome Gandadze. I'm also from WRI. My question is actually for Dr. Lake. I guess I have a question. You had a slide on your deck about democracy and citizen control. And I think that's a really interesting intervention. I guess I was wondering about how we can talk about instances where people are organizing in ways that are not conducive to decarbonization and road safety. I'm thinking particularly about the political unpopularity of a lot of efforts to reduce private vehicle use and the fact that people do often utilize activism. I'm thinking about in Europe and North America, but I'm sure that's around the world, how we can kind of answer to the fact that we have to reconcile our interests in green, safe mobility, but also the fact that there are, when many people are personally asked what they would do, they would rather, empower private vehicles and that kind of thing. Thank you.
So there's no easy answer to that. It has barely been studied. We're just starting to study it now in my lab, and there isn't a huge literature of evidence about that. But a couple of things. One is that we tend to think, oh, wow, active transport or sustainable transport, it's so great. Why wouldn't everyone love it? And we forget that for as long as human beings have been around, change is actually very painful. It involves mourning, it involves fear, it involves a lot of hesitation. So the contestation and the debates are really important. And when we look at that, what we can see is one of the things that's a real source of risk right now is this huge gap between science and power and authority and people. People have been excluded from all three of those things for many, many decades in most places. And what that means is they don't trust the messengers. And if we don't trust the messengers, we don't trust the messages. That's what social psychology has been telling us for a while about behavioral change. So deliberation is really important. Deliberation is a kind of political conversation where we put the social, we put the rational, we put the emotional on the table. We don't control it in the same way as we tend to control our participatory sessions or our informative meetings, which is what most participation is today. It has to be facilitated by people who are very experienced and very sensitive to the dynamics in the room. And when we do that with organizations, what's so great about organizations is their memories, right? There are hard drives. Organizations accumulate relationships, knowledge, experience, self-confidence, trust, credibility. So we really need to do participation with organizations. We need to foster and help organizations to flourish through our participatory processes. And if they stop and say, hey, we don't agree with that, then we should stop and think about it a lot more seriously. Because not everything we think is great is great.
Yes, please go ahead. This is Cecilia Briceño, World Bank. This is a follow-up on the question of green mobility, because it could be particularly if we talk about walkability and walking, it could be by commission or by omission, right? So it's like the default that you cannot afford moving, then walking is a sad, good outcome. Now, I was quite impressed by that graph in the left-hand side in Bogota, in which the highest income quintile, is a quintile? Yes, it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Strata, yes, all right. Has a peak. It's a very interesting trend to see. And I'm going to abuse the presence here of Juan Pablo because that responds to active policies, and that peak there is success, meaning it's not random that the richest people in Bogota are selecting to walk more. So why do you do well? What can we learn?
Can I say a little thing? Yes, it's true, but also it's true that obviously that people from Bogota, they can talk more about that, but it happens also that in the highest income levels, that they walk or they decide to cycle because they have also more access to infrastructure, cycling infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure, because they live in high income areas. And then there is like this inequality between low income areas and high income areas. And then there is a decision behind this toll bar, because they walk more and they cycle more, but because also they have more adequate infrastructure. And also, it's completely true that you are saying that the toll bar in the lowest income, it responds to a necessity because they don't have money to pay for transport options, and they don't have also adequate infrastructure. And in the other extreme, the high income groups, they decide mainly because of health reasons or fitness reasons.
Now, what is interesting is you don't have that shape in the other one. So what is different there? Because the other one has good infrastructure as well in the richest area.
So probably just one other possible explanation is about location matters, meaning that the high income population has shorter trips that are easier to make by bicycle, and of course good infrastructure helps a lot. But the other thing is what has contributed to important increase on cycling in Bogota is the terrible congestion we have. So sometimes for the rich people, it's better to use the bicycle than to drive the car because of time.
One thing, and I reinforce the invitation of Daniel to read the flagship and also especially the chapter of active transport, because there is an interesting also graph for Bogota that it shows the walkability index by income group. And you can see that the highest socioeconomic strata, they are located in areas with, they are located in more walkable areas. And then this can explain also the difference between maybe the socioeconomic strata, that they have better infrastructure for walking, and also they live close to their employment centers and they make shorter trips.
Great, thank you, Henny. I know we're over time, but is it okay to take one? Just this gentleman's been waiting for a long time, and I feel bad. So,
thank you.
Huh? So after just the last question, then we'll close. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Xavier Espinet. I'm a transport economist here at the World Bank. So my question is, actually, in a lot of countries in the region, most of the extreme poverty and Afro-descendants and indigenous communities are in the rural areas. So I'm wondering, and a lot of the discussion today has been more on the urban transport and urban accessibility. So I'm wondering if it's practitioners and people involved in inclusiveness and transport, should we try to bring more this context of rural transport, rural development, or you think that no, that it's better to keep onto the focus onto the urban transport? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so glad you asked that question, because chapter 10 in the flagship is on rural transport. It's turned out to be, it was originally going to be a flagship, a monograph. It turned into a book. It's 11 chapters if you count the conclusions, plus an executive summary. So yes, there is a chapter on rural transport. So I encourage you to take a look at it and reach out to us if you have questions. Thank you. And with that,
I just wanted to say something really quickly.
Sure.
The Afro-descendants and indigenous population in the Caribbean is in very different places than they are in Latin America. So when we're speaking about the region, we still need to understand the nuances between both and who the highest income is in these groups. In
that
space.
Next flagship, we're going to look just at the Caribbean. No, really, I think we need to look more in depth in the Caribbean region, and we need to gather data and create the institutions to do that as well. I'd like to turn the mic over to Ana Maria, our division chief, for closing remarks.
Yeah, just 2 seconds on behalf of the time, but I just like to leave everyone with one, I think, take away that from this session, besides the technical discussion that we have, and that in regards to one of the questions that we go about decision makers and how to get them to think maybe of with the priorities that we've seen today. And I think that's more a reflection for us from the transport sector, that we are convinced of the benefits, of the impacts. We know the data, we have studied for a long time. And I think it's from our side the responsibility to help the decision maker, the politicians, the population to try to close the gap and to recover or to highlight the importance of transport as a key point in policy making. And I'm saying this, I'm following your point, how in some of the big indicators, transport is not one of the priorities. So I think it's in order for these big decisions that we're talking about, infrastructure projects, but as well fares, all these big policy decisions where we have to put lots of the public resources, is in, I would say, from us, from the transport sector, we have to go there and maybe be more humble and think that lots of these transport issues are not in everyone's mind, so everyone priorities come from the community, and how we can close the gap between policymakers, communities, academia, organizations like us. So I think, as you know, the publication has many issues, and I think each of them kind of deserve a session, an event of discuss about transport in rural areas in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and there are lots of issues that we need to tackle, and I think we need to go there with solutions and clear answers for policymakers and decision makers that have a really short span of time. Juan Pablo had it 4 years, really difficult to get results, and I think we that are here for the long run in transport should be like kind of renewing the narrative and the solution. So thank you so much for being here, and please reach out.